Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar of the Land Care Lunch Break series. I'm Kaylee Weeks. I'm a Sustainability Fellow with the City of Portland. We designed this series as a tool to educate and promote Portland's Land Care Ordinance, which prohibits the use of pesticides and synthetic fertilizers on private and public property in the City of Portland. Today, Jason Lilley from the Maine Cooperative Extension will be sharing information about soil science and how to test your soil with us today.
All right. Well, thanks, Kaylee. Can everyone see that screen in full screen? Okay, perfect. So, as Kaylee said, I'm Jason Lilley. I work for the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. I'm based in the local office for you all, where we're right in Falmouth, and my role is primarily working with the farming community in Cumberland, Androscoggin, and Saginaw counties. And one of the primary areas of focus in working with farmers is focused on soil health and helping farmers who are managing large tracts of land to conserve their soil, keep their soil on the farm, and to make it healthier and more vibrant for the production of their crops and livestock critters. So that said, I also have a lot of background in lawn care. I've spent a lot of time in high school, through college, and after college, running my own landscape company and working for other landscapers, and have seen a lot of things that work well and things that really are poor, generally poor practices. So I'm glad to be here with you all today talking about general land care and lawn care, and really some of the nitty-gritty of soil science. I'm going to start out kind of keeping it high level, and then hopefully you've all got your pencils sharpened, because we'll be doing some math here today too. Okay, so the general concept that we're getting at, whether it's at a lawn or on a farm or in a forest ecosystem, is really that soils are the foundation of everything we're trying to do, and really of our whole society. And we spent a lot of time historically, kind of, especially over the last 130 years, taking that for granted. And we have really only focused on one aspect of what we call the soil health triangle, with this chemical component. We figure if we can just dump fertilizers into our soils, that's good enough. We can get productivity. But if we get any sort of like shocks to the system, if we have a drought, or we have a season where it rains, 4 inches every single week, that really, the fact that we have ignored the physical and biological aspects of our soils for so long makes it so that we have zero resilience against those kind of weather extremes, and that we're just kind of like keeping our plants creeping along, and just we've got them on a feeding tube, versus creating a healthy ecosystem where the whole plant can really thrive. So the kind of definition of soil health that we'll be working off of is just the capacity of a soil to function within the ecosystem and land use boundaries, to sustain productivity, maintain environmental quality, and to promote plant and animal health. So, like I said, we've put fertilizers down for 100 years. We've maintained the yields of our crops, but we've really ignored the environmental quality. And that has really changed dramatically in the last 20 years or so, where most of the farms that I'm working with are actively focusing on these various the whole system that equals the soil health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that physical and biological components of the soil, but I'm really going to spend the majority of this session focused on the chemical side of things. So when we're talking about healthy soils, we could have soils that, when we take a handful of it and we blow on our hand, that just goes to dust. It's all these individual grains of soil, whether they're little tiny clay domains. They're so small that they all stick together and make these kind of horizons. It might be silt particles, which are what can blow away or wash away very easily. So if you see a bunch of washout at the bottom of a field or with exposed soils, that's mostly silt particles that are washing away. And then we can have sand grains that is just the same as beach sand. You can see those individual grains with your naked eye. And they're mostly just hanging out there on their own. So if we have poor quality soils, there's no cohesiveness to all these individual soil particles and soil particle sizes in the soil. If we put some effort into adding, compost, not tilling soils so much, being careful when we drive on soils so we aren't compacting and squishing, all those things, and then really trying to have living roots and encourage soil microbiology, then we can get those individual particles to stick together and make what we call soil aggregates. And this is really a key aspect of healthy soils, is having more aggregates that are stuck together. In doing that, we're creating what we call micropores. And these are really tiny, and they make little nooks and crannies that are magnetically charged. So a lot of our soil nutrients, like our fertilizers, have a positive charge to them. And these little micropores in our soils will have negative charge sites, so that those nutrients in a really healthy, balanced way can hang out in our soils instead of just washing out down into groundwater. We can also have macropores from dead roots and earthworms, where we're creating these channels where water can infiltrate down into the soil, as opposed to just sheeting off across the surface and causing a bunch of erosion and taking nutrients with it downhill. So overall, our soils, we're trying to build up to make them really healthy, to encourage these aggregates as much as possible. This is an easier thing to be more intentional about in a farming system or a gardening system. On a lawn, it's a little tricky, but there's a couple of things that we can do to at least not significantly beat up the soils. So this is something that I would expect my grandfather to be out there doing. He probably has some big roof rigged up, a portable pop-up tent or something, so he can stay dry while he's mowing the lawn. But especially down here, this is probably a swale where water is going to concentrate. So if it has been raining for any period of time, this low spot is going to be particularly wet and saturated with water. And when you're driving over these saturated soils, you're going to squish out all that pore space that may have been built up, and you're going to squish and break apart those aggregates and those soil particles that have been built up over time. So, and that's more true if we have like a heavier soil, so a clay type soil that is the foundation of our lawn, and not as true if we have sandy soils. But then if we do have sandy soils, it's harder to get those particles to stick together. So there's more looseness and shiftiness. So paying attention to your soil texture. If you have really wet, heavy soils, being extra careful to not be out there mowing or driving across the lawn when it's wet. Using cultural practices like trying to aerate the soil once every handful of years to physically break up the soil a little bit and make more to kind of undo the compaction that is caused by the lawnmower. And then adding organic matter, like top dressing with compost or using organic fertilizers, is a way to increase that soil structure. So we're trying to avoid compaction, increase moisture content, and increase organic matter to have better soil structure and overall healthier soils. Okay, so that's the kind of the extent of, even though it's all related, it's kind of the extent of what I'm going to say about the physical and biological properties. I'm happy to take questions at any point. But for now, I'm going to move on and talk more about the nutrient levels and the chemical side of what's happening in the soils. So this is a chart of what's happening in Lake Champlain. So Vermont is on the east side of Lake Champlain, New York's on the west side, and then I believe it's Quebec is on the north side. And all around that lake, these charts on the side are representative of the phosphorus levels that are in the water. And the dotted line with blue below it, that means that in those areas where you only see blue, that the water levels are below the acceptable amount of phosphorus in the water. And if they are above and they're showing red, then they're above the acceptable levels of phosphorus. And we see up here in the northeastern part of the lake, especially, but some down in the southwestern as well, there are very high levels of phosphorus, and they have kind of maintained being so high over time from 1990 to the 2020. If we kind of zoomed out, we would see that there's a lot of dairy farms in these areas, and the application of manure to those fields is kind of super loading the lake with this phosphorus, which is causing problems. I'll get to those. The same thing's happening in the Chesapeake Bay down in the Delmarva Peninsula. And the colors in the bay here on this chart are reflecting the dissolved oxygen that's in the water. And we see that a very large portion of this has essentially zero dissolved oxygen, which means that this bay that was once just filled with life and crabs and fish species and just all these marine aquatic species, they don't have any oxygen to survive on in the water. And that is also because of mostly phosphorus and some nitrogen loading that is getting into that water. It's creating algal blooms, and those algal blooms, the activity of that algae, it absorbs all of that oxygen and sucks it out of the water. So what was once a vibrant fisheries, anybody who made their living fishing in this giant bay has had to move or shift what they do. And that is mostly because we're taking grain, corn, and soybeans from the Midwest, and those grains have absorbed nutrients out of the soils in the very fertile and rich soils in the Midwest, plus the fertilizer that gets dumped onto those. Then we take those grains and we ship them down to the Chesapeake Bay and some of it up to Vermont and New York. We feed it out to livestock, and those nutrients then transfer through to the manure of the animals, and it isn't cost effective to ship the manure back out to the Midwest for a closed loop system. So then local farmers over apply those, and the nutrients that don't get utilized end up in the waterway as a pretty significant source of pollution. So we all have our beloved Casco Bay here that is a pretty amazing resource for us all to live around and be able to recreate from, and to get fisheries and economic vitality for a lot of our community. And luckily we aren't at the point of contamination as these other areas are, but we need to make sure that we're keeping it that way. So if we look at just this one red dot up at the kind of uppermost, the head of tide for the Fore River, that is an area that is let's see, I think it has low dissolved oxygen, its pH is acidic, and there's a lot of sedimentation happening at those sites. I believe that this chart is also showing something related to like E. coli levels as well, but at the very least it is showing dissolved oxygen. These sites out around here are wastewater treatment facilities. And so there's some leakage happening from those wastewater treatment facilities that needs to be addressed. But up here, the primary cause of that contamination is being is due to road runoff, fertilizers from lawns, sewer pipe overflow, and nitrogen and sediment flushed from the salt marsh. But we wanted to point out that part, that fertilizer from lawns is being attributed to why this is a concern up in this area. So overall, key causes of decreased quality for our watersheds is air pollution, and this is becoming less and less of an issue. But we used to have acidification, a lot of sulfur emissions from plants kind of in like that, well, just west of here. So that like Pittsburgh, Ohio area, there were a lot of steel plants, and that was causing a lot of pollution, air pollution that would then get rained out here and cause acidification of soils and waterways. That's mostly been cleaned up because of EPA regulations. At this point, the biggest concern is nutrient loading, mostly from nitrogen and phosphorus. And that's coming from wastewater treatment and sewage, from poor nutrient management on agricultural lands, and from lawn care. So that's what we're going to focus on as a lawn care aspect here. So here's a big jumble of spaghetti lines. So I'm not going to quiz anyone on the nitrogen cycle at the end of this talk, but I do want to point out what this is showing is how complex nitrogen is in the soil, and how many different ways it can move around, and how many forms it can exist in. But the big thing that I wanted to point out here are the red blocks of the ways that nitrogen can be lost from a system. So they can be lost in crop harvest. So as an example, if you're mowing the lawn and you blast all your clippings out into the street, that's not only dangerous for bicycles and motorcycles, but those lawn clippings are loaded with nutrients, and those are going to wash off into stormwater drains, and then they're gone. We can also have, if we apply fertilizers onto like bare soils or onto impervious surfaces, a lot of those fertilizers can allow that nitrogen to just gas off and go up into the air. And nitrous oxide gas is something like 230 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than methane and CO2. So we definitely want to do whatever we can to keep the nitrogen from just gassing off. If we get too much rain and there's too much nitrogen in the soil, it can leach down through the soil into groundwater. And also it can be washed across the surface, and through erosion and runoff, we can lose nitrogen that way. Phosphorus, it's a little more stable as a nutrient, but again, through lawn clippings, we can lose phosphorus from the system and send them to places that we don't want them. And also actual movement of soil can cause erosion, and that's the primary cause of loss for phosphorus. So I might ask for input. I just learned that there might be some changes coming to this, but the purpose of this meeting is to really highlight the lawn ordinances that are relatively new to Portland, and to tailor, how we think about testing soils and applying fertilizers to lawns so that they're within the confines of the Portland Lawn Ordinance. So, Troy, do you mind just, are there any changes to what I've got listed here that folks should be aware of?
So the only thing that we're considering is changing the soil test requirement to, rather than being the comprehensive soil test, to be the standard soil test. Would be, actually would appreciate your input if that's something that makes sense from your perspective. And we're also considering changing the requirement from every year to every 3 years.
Yeah, I'm strongly in favor of both of those changes. So, yep. Okay, so I will keep those in mind as we move forward. But just to point it out, the Portland Lawn Ordinance states that synthetic pesticides and fertilizers are prohibited for use within city bounds. Currently, a comprehensive soil test, which includes the nitrogen recommendation, must be conducted prior to applying only organic type fertilizers. So the comprehensive test is a little bit more expensive and includes that nitrogen test. The standard test has everything except for nitrogen. And the reason for that is because of this. Nitrogen is so complicated, it moves around so quickly that unless you're testing 2 to 3 weeks before you plan to fertilize, that nitrogen it's hard to pinpoint. So it limits when you can take the test, and also you have to handle your soil sample just in a very precise way. So moving to a standard soil test makes a lot of sense, and it's going to be cheaper for folks. And lastly, the fertilizers cannot contain phosphorus unless the soil test requires it. So that's a good bullet point to include there too. Okay, and I do want to stress that organic lawn care doesn't mean just going hands off. So just not paying attention to fertility in your lawn, it can lead to having more weeds and more pest pressure on the lawn, and that can lead to kind of environmental issues. And also, so the best way to beat weeds, whether it's in a lawn or in a hay field or in a cropping system, is to have proper fertility in place so that the good species can outcompete the weed species. And the last point here is that an unhealthy lawn can lead to bare spots. So you can have moss, but especially if you just have bare soil there, that's going to be a big primer. Even if they're under fertilized soils, there's still going to be sediment loss and nutrient loss from having bare soils around. So paying attention to your fertility and investing in some fertilizer is going to keep a healthier, nicer looking lawn and minimize any sort of environmental concerns. Okay. So we're going to get into soil chemistry here. So thinking back on your chemistry classes, here we have our pH scale, or a segment of it. And this is essentially just units of how much hydrogen and how much hydroxide is in a solution. And in this specific situation, it's in the soil solution. And our soil test is going to give us an exact point of where our soils are at on this pH scale. And ideally, the best place for that to be for optimal grass growth is between 6 and a 7 on the pH scale. And why that's relevant is mostly because of the chemical interactions in the soil and how plants are able to take up nutrients. And we can see, so each of these bars represents a different soil nutrient, and the wider that the bar is, the more available that nutrient is to the plant at that pH. So we see if we're down here at 4.0, for a grass plant anyway, it wouldn't really be able to take up any molybdenum, boron, manganese, nitrogen, phosphorus. It just wouldn't be able to access those nutrients, even if they were in the soil. Same thing if we're too high. So my grandfather would always say, you just need to sweeten up the soil. So he goes out and he applies like a whole bunch of lime every single spring. And I'm sure that his pH is like 8.5 or 9. And you start to see detriment on that side, just as much as if you were too low. So, just going out and adding fertilizers blindly, doesn't really work. Like with all these nutrients and our pH, we're trying to find a sweet spot. We're not trying to just have a lot or a little out there. So this is the form. This is kind of step one for testing your soils. And we have these forms at our office here in Falmouth. We also have these available at a lot of the garden centers around Portland and Cumberland County. And you can also call us if you don't have a way to get to our offices. This is kind of like a carbon copy form, but there are 3 separate pages on it, and I'll kind of walk through 2 of those most important pages. All the instructions are listed right here, but the main thing we want to do is choose which kind of test we want to take. So if we wanted to do the comprehensive test, and they would give us an exact amount of nitrogen that's in the soil at that point, we could tick off the C here for comprehensive, and that's $25. It sounds like the city's moving towards just doing a standard test, so you could tick off the S, and that's $20 for that sample. You may want to do a test for your front lawn, for your back lawn, for your raised beds, and for your apple trees. Or let's say blueberries, because they have a kind of different requirements. If you're doing that, you would take a comprehensive or a representative soil sample in each of those areas, and I'll walk you through that. And you would just write front lawn, back lawn, blueberries, raised beds, and you can submit 4 different soil boxes. So we've got little boxes that you can fold up and put your soil sample into. You can send 4 of those with 1 form with the kind of code name for each of those samples. You want to include your square feet, like how big is the area that you're testing from. And really the next and kind of last important thing is to look at your recommendations or your crop code. So this is on sheet number 3. So other than that, you just want to make sure that you clearly fill out all of your contact information, the total amount, and then send a check with the form, your soil sample, and your check. We don't take those samples here at the office, so that would be up to you to either get them up to Orono, or you can mail them directly to the lab at this address. So this is page 3 of that form, and what we're going to be doing is testing the soil and determining what is currently there. So what's there for nutrients, and then depending on what you fill out and what you select for a crop code, they will give you recommendations for what to fertilize with and how much based on what those crops need. So they're looking at the difference between what's there and what the crop generally needs on average. So for what we're looking at, crop 201 would be a lawn or a playground, and that's an existing lawn, so not new turf, but you could do that if that was your situation. You may also want to just write in, so code 201, and then just write across here organic recommendations, because they can make that change, but they don't have that as a standard code for some reason. They might be going to add that on. And then if you're doing an organic vegetable garden, you pick code 392. If you're doing your ornamentals, you can select from any of these down here. So that crop code is very helpful. The actual process for taking your soil sample, we use these probes that are 7/8 of an inch across, and that helps us get a very uniform column from the soil surface down 6 inches into the soil, and then we can poke those out, and we'll take about 10 samples per testing area. So let's say that we had a pile of compost brought last year to the yard, and it was all dumped right here. And now this season, we might not be able to see that compost or that it was there, but this part of the garden or the lawn is going to be super loaded with nutrients. So it's not representative of what is across the whole area. So that's why we're going to take, this is what we're doing for like precision's sake, but you can take a trowel or a little shovel, and when you take that, you take say a trowel, it's usually like triangular shaped, right? So I like to flick away the upper corner on both sides so that you have somewhat of an even diameter of a column of soil to represent going down through. So you take your trowel and you take a 6-inch little scoop out of 10 different areas, put it into a clean bucket, mix it all together, and then pour as much as you can into one of these boxes to fill it up. And then there's you probably can't see it, but there's lines on the box, so you can fill in your information. You want to make sure that what's on this box matches that sample on your form, sample name. You want to try to avoid metal, like don't get a rusty old trowel or shovel or bucket, because we're testing for metals like iron, and testing for lead too. So there's some things that we want to have clean, and generally plastic. But if you take like a little steel wool or something and scrape down a trowel before you get started, that's good enough to not contaminate the sample. Okay, so you'll send those up to the lab, and then in the springtime, it's usually about 3 weeks. Most of the year, it's 2 weeks to get your results back. And this is what you'll get. They'll send this in the mail, and if you fill out the email portion, they'll email it to you directly. This also comes to our office. So I'm going to walk through how to interpret this right now, but we fully understand that this is a lot to look at and it can be kind of overwhelming. So at the extension office, we can help you interpret these and make sense of it all. But to start to break this down, it's kind of the results are in 3 sections. The upper third is like a visual representation of what's currently in the soils. So just looking at the bar chart without looking at anything else, feel free to unmute yourself or write into the chat. Do you think that this is a generally healthy or hungry or overfed soil?
I'm gonna say it doesn't look too bad. Looks like pretty good.
Right. Yep. Appreciate that. So yeah, I think that this is pretty good. So this was taken in July. So oh no, sorry, it was taken in May there. So this is pre-season, so it's gone through the winter. We would expect that all the nitrogen would have, for the most part, flushed out. So this is a comprehensive soil because it has that nitrate level there, comprehensive test. Let's say, so last year we would have fertilized this area and it would have brought it up to like the upper portion of optimum, but then through the growth of the vegetables in this area, they would have taken some nutrients away. So we would expect that would get down to the lower end of medium, or upper end of medium, lower end of optimum. And then this is kind of the cycle. Like in the springtime, we fertilize, come here, and then those will drop back down. In a lawn, hopefully we're leaving clippings on the lawn, so there's much less extraction of nutrients out of the system. So we might just be like kind of a much smaller yo-yo season to season, but there's still always going to be losses of those nutrients. So anyway, this first section is a way to just kind of visually look and say we're generally doing pretty good. We would expect our nitrogen to be low. Our pH is right where we want it, right at the optimum level. But another thing to keep in mind, and this is very true for a lot of organic farms that you, or and sometimes even more so for organic vegetable gardens, is that they use a lot of compost, and a lot of those composts are manure based, and that manure is very high in phosphorus. So we'll get these samples that there's 8 of these nutrients and they're up in this above optimum range, and everybody's like, look, we're doing amazing. And it's like, no, you're super loaded on those nutrients, and especially for phosphorus, that's risky because there's a higher potential for those nutrients to wash away. So some of these are a concern for the crop, but most of them, when they get above optimum, are environmental concerns. Okay, so the second section is a numerical representation of what's currently in the soil sample. So we can look up here, soil pH. The graph says just above optimum. If we look at the level found, it says 6.3. If we go down to our numerical results, it says soil pH. The level found was 6.3. And the optimum range for this crop, which this is crop code 201, so it's an existing lawn is what we're talking about here. That the optimum range, they say, is 5.5 to 6.5. So I guess the resource I looked at had a slight disagreement from the lab, but I'll take that up with Bruce, the lab manager. And you can look right down the line and look at your different nutrients and see how many of these are out of whack and how far out of the level that they're supposed to be that they're in. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've looked at what's in the soil, and now this third section is what we need to do to amend the soils to get them into the optimum range. So let's dive into that recommendation section. So this recommendation section is usually broken up into 3 sections. Again, the upper paragraph or segment is about your pH adjustment. So this is the first thing we want to do. This takes a long time to make the adjustments. So even after you apply lime, if that's what you need to do, it can be like 6 months for that change to go into effect. But our recommendation on this soil is to not do anything. So there's no lime recommended. We're already in a good pH range. If you've been applying wood ash or lime just regularly over a long period of time, you're likely going to be too high. And if that's the case, in this section, they would recommend putting sulfur on to acidify the soil. But most of the time, there's going to be a lime recommendation, if anything, in this section. Then we have our nutrient need. So here we're just talking about the actual nutrient, and we need to separate that in our minds from fertilizer. So there's nutrients and then there's fertilizer. So the nutrient needs is that on every 1,000 square feet, so this is very important that we're dealing in like a specific set unit. And for lawns and gardens, mostly it's going to be on the 1,000 square foot unit. But for every 1,000 square feet, we need to put 2 pounds of nitrogen, 0.7 pounds of phosphate, and 2.3 pounds of potash or potassium down. Now, where it gets complicated is we need to start thinking about how we translate these pounds of nutrient into pounds of fertilizer. And this is just what you're going to see from the lab. This might be, usually is pretty confusing, but we'll do some adjustments and I'll walk you through all that. So this is saying that you'd apply 17 pounds of a fertilizer that is considered a 12-4-8 fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. So if you've looked at a fertilizer bag before, it usually has those 3 numbers on it, right? So this means that this is 12% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8% potassium. So that's NPK. So if we did 17 pounds times 0.12 is 12% nitrogen, it should, I think, get us into this 2 pounds of nitrogen range. So, but I'll break that down some more. And then there's recommendations on how to go about applying it. So they're saying that you should only do half of this. So half of 17, it's like 8.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet in the spring, and then do the other half in August. So that makes it so that you don't get all sorts of growth. Anyway, the split applications can be very helpful. And then there's recommendations if you're just dropping your clippings versus collecting them, and all sorts of kind of additional information added. So you're really just kind of following those instructions. But again, we've got our NPK, so 2 pounds of nitrogen, 0.7, 2.3.
Can I ask a question, Jason?
Absolutely.
Oh, on the fertilizer need part. So in Portland, we only allow organic fertilizers on lawns. So it says, in the text here, it says for organic fertilizers, adjust the rate to provide 1 pound of nitrogen. How does that relate to the recommendations higher in the up previously?
I was trying to wrap my head around that. Maybe it's, see, organic fertilizer is usually slower release. So my initial reaction would have been to go higher on the organic application.
Mhm.
So I guess I don't have a good answer for you as to why they have half that for the organic side of things.
Mm. Okay. Fair
Yeah,
enough.
sorry. But that is a good point, that this initial, because we just did 201, we didn't say crop code 201, please give us organic recommendations, that they gave us a conventional fertilizer. So we're going to start with that, and then we'll move to select an organic fertilizer off of this.
Great. Thank you.
So again, these analyses is that when they ran a test on the fertilizer, it's 12% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8%. Okay, yeah, right. 8% potassium. What that means is if we had 100 pounds of fertilizer, there would be 12 pounds of nitrogen, 4 pounds of phosphorus, and 8 pounds of potassium. Just on those percentages. So we know that we, by the ordinance, can't use this fertilizer. So we're going to look at these ratios. We'll go back to the actual nutrient needs and look at these ratios to find something that does work for us. And generally speaking, when we're doing these calculations, we're going to try to find a fertilizer that has as close of that ratio as possible, but then we're going to do our actual calculations just for nitrogen. So that's generally thought to be the more important of the nutrients for plant growth anyway. So let's see. So now we're still doing math related to the 12-4-8 fertilizer. So the way that you want to line up this math, and you can use the bottom line here that I'm going to show for how to do this generally. But for this example, we know that we need 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And the fertilizer that we have is 0.12 or 12% fertilizer. So we'll go 0.12. So we're going to divide 2 pounds by 0.12. And that gives us 16.6 pounds of fertilizer that we need to apply to 1,000 square feet to give us 2 pounds of nitrogen. Clear as mud. So, okay. But this is kind of the base thing. The pounds of the nutrient that you need divided by the concentration of the nutrient in your fertilizer, and that gives you the pounds of fertilizer that you need per unit area. And there's some good resources on this. So this is the Maine Soil Testing Lab's website. And in the bar on the left, there's a component called Understanding Recommendations. And when you click on that, there's some good resources. And one of them is choosing blended natural fertilizers. So you can reach out to us. I think they'll also give you organic options if you write that in for your crop code. But we'll go through the whole process of like what I do when I'm talking to folks. So I click on this choosing blended fertilizers, and they give us all these like different options that are available in the world for organic fertilizers. And some of these are more readily available than others. And luckily, the ratio that we got and the ratio that come back on a lot of lawn and small garden tests kind of matches with some readily available fertilizers. So going back to our soil test, we need 2.5 pounds of nitrogen, 1.1 phosphorus, and 2 pounds of potassium. And just to kind of simplify it, we need a 2-1-2 or maybe a 3-1-2. And we're gonna maybe to if we take that, we divide it by, or we multiply it times 1.5, that would give us the same ratio. But let's say that we take this and we multiply it by 2. So that gives us 5 for the N column, 2 for the P column, and 4 for the K column. Do you see anything there that's similar to that?
Looks like that North Country Organics one's pretty close.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking too, that 5-3-4. And this is one that is really commonly available. It comes in a big blue bag. So if we broke that down, we'd have 2.5, 1.5, and then 2. So that's pretty close. That's really close. So then we're going to take our, we need 2.5 pounds of nitrogen. We're going to divide by the concentration of nitrogen in the fertilizer. So it's 0.05. And that tells us that we need 50 pounds of this 5-3-4 fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. That works out pretty good. We can go and buy 1 bag of this, spread it out there, and we've got the nutrients we need for the season. Any questions about that? Everybody thought that they were gonna have to do complex ratios and math equations for their lunch break.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
With the fertilizer, I know you're talking about like the nitrogen, phosphorus and stuff, but what comprises kind of like the remainder of the fertilizer?
Yeah, so for our organic fertilizers, these are mostly all, well, these are all blends of things like poultry manure, um, feather meal, peanut meal, blood meal. So they've taken all these organic materials, and most of those, like I think blood meal is maybe 12-13% nitrogen, and the remainder of that is like carbon. So it's not the chemical fertilizers. There's different like fillers to that, but most of it is like just a carbon that is adding organic matter to your soil.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. Okay, so that's kind of the meat and potatoes. So like I said, you know, you get those results back. If your head's spinning or they gave you a fertilizer type that you should use, but you can't find it in the store, or you have some in your shed that you've used for the garden in the past, we can help you do the math to figure out how much of that different type of fertilizer to put on to match your soil test results. But again, I just want to kind of bring it back that we're focused on the health of the garden soils, trying to get that physical, biological, and chemical, the nutrient levels in balance. And so some general recommendations to kind of wrap up. We want to try to keep the soils uncompacted and as porous as possible. So maybe do some aeration. Want to work to increase the organic matter levels. So just dropping clippings, potentially adding a little bit of compost as a top dress every once in a while if it's needed. Want to really, you know, again, think about the plant itself and not just the soils. So keeping the soil moisture and fertility just right so that those plants are healthy. And mowing higher will allow the roots of those plants to grow longer so you can so they can access more water and more nutrients. So trying to keep your grass at least 3 inches long. And then, you know, if you have a shady area or a full sun area, making sure that you've got the right species of grass and the right type of grass seed that you've selected so that those plants are where they want to be. So that holistic approach includes their soil tests and amending based on test results, not over applying and not under applying, dethatching the lawn and top dressing with grass seed if it's needed in the springtime. Again, cutting the lawn to the appropriate height and irrigating appropriately. So we're shooting for 1 to 1.5 inch of water per week, and trying to water and get that water down deep into the soil. So longer waterings, and trying to avoid watering when it's raining. That's it always makes me scratch my head. Let's see. I want to avoid compaction, aerate every 1 to 3 years. And kind of when you start to put that all in place, you should have a nice vibrant lawn that isn't contributing to kind of environmental concerns for the broader community. So that's what I've got for you.
Thank you. That's great. I do have another question regarding composting. So we don't regulate compost as fertilizer, and we certainly encourage people to use it. So how often do you think, or is there a way people should determine when and how much compost they should use?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I would say if you think you have really compacted soils, if you have areas that are particularly unhealthy, then using compost to try to like jumpstart some of those. It works as a great like mulch over seeded areas, so you got some coverage over the seed. But yeah, I mean, I think that compost is a kind of limited resource, and it does kind of come with some of its own potential concerns. So I don't really recommend folks to use it too heavily on a lawn, but it does help as just a skimming. And we recommend like going for a salt and pepper approach. It shouldn't be like a mat. It just look like you spread, you know, pepper on your mashed potatoes.
Great. That's good. Thank you.
Yep. And another thing with fertilizer and with compost, you know, I've worked for operations and we take those push spin spreaders and we're just blasting the sidewalk and the street with fertilizer granulars or with compost. And you know, those drop spreaders where everything goes straight down, it might take you a few more passes back and forth, but it's really going to prevent that completely unnecessary, you know, waste of expensive fertilizer, but also just all those nutrients are going right into the wastewater drains. So being intentional about how and where you spread those nutrients is important.
Yeah, excellent.
I have a question about using the test.
Mhm.
So there's not a whole lot of options for like organic, non-vegetable on there. So an
Mhm.
example would be I have an area of my lawn that is like blueberries and is like more acidic, or you know, what would you suggest for that? It's not commercial at all. It's not large. There's not a whole lot of it, but it's a very dedicated area.
Yeah. So the lab is getting more used to some write-ins, and it's really not too big of a deal because it's just like they're just punching in those codes and all the math is done automatically. So I would recommend that you put in the closest crop code that you can get. So if it's high bush blueberries, put that in. Generally, if you can, there are distinctions between commercial and backyard. So if there's an option for backyard, pick that. But then just do the write-in and write in organic fertilizer options, and they'll get you those.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any more questions? Thank you, Jason, for your presentation. It was exactly what we were looking for.
Perfect. Good. Well, thanks for having me. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank
Great.
you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.